Hey, what's going on, guys? In the last video, we edited a bunch of photos. I believe that recording was about an hour long, so if you actually stayed through the whole thing, that is awesome. In this video, I have one photo that I want to take through the entire editing process with you guys. So we're going to start inside Lightroom. We're then going to take it into Photoshop, where I'm going to show you how I retouch the skin, and we are going to edit this from start to finish. So without further ado, we're going to jump right into Lightroom here. So I've got the photo already up, and this is essentially our end photo right here. So what we're going to be doing is editing this inside Lightroom, taking it into Photoshop. I'm going to show you a few tricks to essentially add in detail on the side of your image, because right now if we crop this for Instagram, we're going to be losing a lot of detail down here, like her shorts, and I don't really want to have the crop looking like this. I want more space on the upper part, and I want to make sure that her eyes are on the thirds. So for now, we're going to edit this as shot. We're not going to crop it, and we're just going to hit this with a soft. So right here, what we're going to do is just bring up the exposure just a little bit. I still want to keep quite a bit of detail in the back. If we bring it up too much, we're going to blow out some of those blues. So we're going to bring it about here. Looks good. We're just going to zoom in because you can see a little bit of red from her lips and on her nose here. So we're just going to reduce that. We're going to come down here to our saturation, and you can see exactly, if I just pump this up, what it is controlling. So we're just going to lower that a little bit. We don't want to just kill it because we've got some grays going in here, and we don't really want that. So we're just going to have it about a nice medium about here. And what we're going to do is we're just going to come up here and grab a radial filter. We're going to drag it pretty big around her just to bring her a little bit into the foreground so she's not getting lost in the background. We're also going to increase our feather to 100% so we have the biggest fall off from 0 to 100. And we're just going to bring this in here. So if we just hover over this, or you can click show selected mask, it'll show you exactly what you're doing or the area you're selecting. We're also going to add just a little bit of sharpness about there, and I'm going to leave this as is. So we're just going to close out of our radial filter here, and we're going to come into her face, where we're just going to add a little bit of exposure, highlights, and texture to her eyes. So we're going to do this with the adjustment brush. We're just going to, I'm using a scroll wheel to make it bigger or smaller, and we're just going to draw just like this over top of the blue part of her eyes, and we're going to increase the exposure. Something about there. We're also going to bring up our texture just a little bit, and our highlights. Maybe about there, just to make her eyes pop a little bit. We can also mess with the temperature if you want to bring in more of those blues, have that ice blue look in her eyes. Or if you want to remove that and go a different route, we can also increase it, make it warmer, so we have more of a hazelnut look. But for this, she has naturally blue eyes, so I'm actually just going to bring that just a little bit towards the blue so we can accentuate that feature. We're just going to lower the highlights. I think that's a little bit too much, and maybe some contrast. So now if we just come down here and toggle it with this, we can see the before and the after. So a lot more punchy with the eyes. Definitely a huge focal point, so you want that to be seen. We're also going to add just a little bit of shine to her nose ring. So I'm going to come back into our brush here, make it pretty small, and just kind of really lightly brush over top of the shine part on her nose ring. So we're just affecting that. We're just going to bring up the exposure just a little bit, just so it has a little bit more of an emphasis on the feature. And we're going to, next, I think we're just going to brighten her eyes just a little bit. So we're going to do this with our radial filter, bring it out about there, and we're going to increase our exposure just a tiny bit. So the goal here is to essentially make this kind of similar to these tones here in terms of lightness. So before it was rather dark, kind of makes your model look a little aged when it's dark around the eyes. So we're just going to pump in a little bit of that color, just like so, and we're going to drag another circle on the other eye here. We're actually going to rotate this one just a little bit so we can squish it, and we're going to do the exact same, just a little bit of exposure. Maybe a little less on the far eye, because this here is our focal, our main feature, so we don't want this to be like too overpowering. It is in shadow, so keep that in mind. So we're just going to unclick our radial filter and come out here. So I think what we're going to do is add a little bit more exposure, just make it a little brighter, probably around there. And we're going to come into our spot removal and just kind of get rid of the bags under her eyes, so something like this. And actually that did a pretty good job, but we're going to go around here and we're going to click clone. Heal is the way to go, so we're just going to use heal for this one. About there. And that looks good to me. We're just going to unselect that. So you can see just got rid of her bag under her eyes. We're just going to back out here and this is essentially done. So what I'm going to do is just straighten that a little bit. And that looks good to me. Next, I think we are going to bring this into Photoshop where we're going to be retouching the skin. And I'm going to show you that interesting trick to add in the details that would otherwise be lost with our crop. So we're just going to right click, edit in Photoshop. Alright, so here we are inside Photoshop. So first thing that I want to do is retouch her skin. So what we're going to do is unlock our layer and we're going to be doing what's called frequency separation. So we're going to duplicate our layer twice with Control J. On our middle layer, we're just going to call this blur. And this top layer, we're just going to call this frequency. So we're just going to keep these fairly organized. This bottom layer, that's just your control layer, so you can see the difference after you've applied the effects. So on our blur layer, here I'm just going to hide the frequency layer so you can see what we're doing. We're going to come up to filter, blur, Gaussian blur. 7 pixels is pretty good. That's usually what I do. For something that you have like a really large file size, you might need a little bit more. For something like this photo, I'm going to do we'll do about 8 pixels, hit OK. And we're going to unhide our frequency layer, select it, and we're going to come up to image, apply image, and here we're going to, under layer, select our blur layer, and make sure that our blending mode is set to subtract. By default, these will be changed, so set your scale to 2 and your offset to 128. And essentially what this is doing is taking the details from your blur and reversing them. So it's separating the details from your blur layer. So if we now set this to linear light, and we group these, so we're just going to shift click and drag these into a group. You'll notice if you toggle these layers, there will actually be no difference between your original layer and these two, because we've taken the details from our blur layer and just put them on a new layer. So everything we're going to be doing is going to be on our blur layer, so we aren't affecting the actual skin details. So we're going to click our blur layer. We're going to hit Z and just zoom in here a little bit like so. And we're going to come over to our brush and we're going to be using the mixer brush tool. So I want you to just copy down these settings here at the top. These are what I usually use. Make sure that this is not checked. So by default it's checked. Just make sure it's unchecked and we've only got this one selected. And what that's going to do is just play around with the highlights and shadows as opposed to actually mixing in the colors on your blur layer. So now what we're going to do, we're zoom in a little bit more here and we're just maybe about there. And with our mixer brush selected, we're just going to be pushing and pulling our shadows to essentially even out the lighting on her face. So we're just going to do a little bit like this. We're going to grab from here. This kind of works like the smudge tool. So if you're familiar with the smudge tool, I'll just show you super quickly what the smudge tool does, which is right here. It essentially grabs it and it kind of drags anything that you select. So the mixer brush is essentially doing the same thing, but only for our shadows and our highlights within our image. So we can drag and push and pull our highlights and our shadows. Without, and of course since our frequency is separated, we can do this without affecting our skin details. So we're just going to come in here and click around, essentially just kind of evening out all the shadows on her face. Now you can spend as much time as you want on this particular step. Personally, I don't spend too much time. I do know people that spend hours using frequency separation and then going in and doing local dodge and burn, which we will be doing in a second. But for my photos, I don't usually do that too much for too long, because I honestly believe that I believe in kind of keeping the natural skin tones and not pushing it too far into that unrealistic, clearly photoshopped skin that you see in a lot of Instagram posts. So with this done, I'm going to call this done about there. If you just toggle your group, you can see what the difference is. So honestly, just with a few clicks, you can immediately see a pretty big difference in the shadows on her face. And what we're going to do is also just make a bigger brush. So I'm using the bracket keys just to make my brush bigger. And we're just going to do the same thing on her arms here, just to even out some of these shadows. Now the reason we're using a bigger brush is because these are general shadows, so they're pretty large. You don't have to worry too much about being really precise. So we're just going to be clicking around in here, around there, looks good. And a little bit on her hand. So now if we just, whoops, oh, what am I doing? Exit out of that. Oh, okay, I just changed the pin light back to normal. Okay, so we're going to hit Z, our hotkeys work, and our Alt key just to back out. So you can already see here with just a few clicks there is quite a big difference in our image. So next what I'm going to be doing is what's called local dodge and burn. So we're going to be making 2 layers on top of our group, and they're going to be adjustment layers. So we're going to be adding a curves adjustment, and we're going to be grabbing this and just dragging it a little bit down towards our shadows, and we're going to call this dark. Now what we're going to do is click on our mask and hit Control I to invert it so it's not affecting our image, and we're going to go back to our adjustments and add another one, and we're going to be doing the opposite. So this one will be our light. And we're going to do the same, Control I on our layer just to hide it. And we're going to be zooming in here. So what we're going to do is start with our light. We're going to come over to our brush tool, not our mixer brush, but our brush tool. We're going to be changing our opacity to something very small, like 10. You can use your number keys on your keyboard to change the opacity up here. And we're just going to zoom in now. And essentially what we're going to do is make a really small brush. And you can kind of see, actually, you know what we'll do is we're going to add a saturation layer. So this just makes it a little easier to visualize, but what we're going to be doing is you can kind of see the light areas and dark areas, sort of very small blemish imperfections in the skin and the shadows. This is very common, but what this technique allows us to do is smooth those areas out. So we're going to come in here and we're just going to click around with our light layer selected. Oh, make sure that your colors are set to white. So make sure that you're painting white on your mask. So just hit X if you want to invert that and paint with a different color. So what I'm going to do is just click around, and I'm going to be setting this to a bit of a time lapse just so you guys can see what I'm doing, because people can honestly spend hours on this stage slowly refining their image and removing any small imperfections. This is probably the biggest stage when you're looking at those highly processed photos that you see on Instagram. Those artists spent hours essentially just coming in here and removing any small blemishes. Personally, I don't like working with the saturation. I can see it just fine, but you're just going to be removing these shadows. Alright, so we are back in real time here, so I didn't do too much, but I'm just going to toggle the layer here. You can kind of see what it did mainly in this area. So that's just our light area. Now we're going to go in again with our dark layer selected, and we're going to be essentially doing the same thing but to the lighter areas. So we're just going to reapply our hue and saturation, and we're just going to come in here to any layers that seem a little bit light like this. And we're just going to even those out. Alright, so for the sake of this tutorial, I'm not going to be going too much further into it. You can already see, we'll just toggle the dark. There really isn't much of a difference with the dark. I just did a little bit in here. The biggest difference for me was the light. Again, you guys can spend as much time as you want in this stage. The more you refine, the better your skin tones are going to look. So what we can do is actually group both of the things that we did here. So we've got our dodge and burn, and we've got our frequency separation, and we can just toggle that and you can see exactly what we did with the skin. So it looks much cleaner afterwards. So the next thing we're going to be doing is essentially cropping this for Instagram and making sure that we still have a nice frame, even though Instagram's crop could potentially ruin our photo. So actually, before we do that, we're just going to bring this into Lightroom to add any grain or final adjustments you might want to add. So in order to do that, you're just going to hit Control S on your keyboard, and Lightroom, I already have it open, but Lightroom will actually open up a separate image, a new image that will have all your adjustments baked already into it. So what we can do, sorry, I'm just going to turn this off, is at this stage, this is where I would turn that off as well. So we have our raw input like that. Okay. So I actually recorded this already, but I found that the audio on my mic cut out. So we're doing it again. But essentially, once it's back in Lightroom, you can add any final adjustments you want to add. So we can look through our modifiers on the side here. One that I really enjoyed was shadow lift. I thought this was kind of cool, although I would take a lot of this back out and probably reduce it. Another way you could add in that sort of depth and contrast is by just adding the contrast through the slider. This is also when I would add my grain. So we're just going to, under our tools, add grain, and we can look at something like a vignette. Might look cool. But essentially that's our final image. So what we're now going to do is I'm going to show you that Photoshop trick. So we're going to be bringing this back into Photoshop. So we're going to right click, edit in Photoshop. And we're just going to hit edit a copy with Lightroom Adjustments. Now that, I think that opened the original here without the grain. Yeah, there's no grain on this. Okay, so I'm just going to close out of this. Actually, no, I'm not. What I'm going to do is just open a different one here. And for the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to crop it like this. So we have our Instagram crop, yep, and open in Photoshop. I'm actually kind of confused as to why it won't reopen. I think it's because it thinks I have it open already. But what we can do, what you're going to do is essentially just reopen that photo inside Photoshop. I'm going to try it one more time. Edit as Smart Object in Photoshop. Maybe this will work. And okay, so that brought it in. It just made sure that our layer is a Smart Object. So we can just right click and come down here to rasterize layer to get rid of that. But what we're going to do is drag this into our cropped frame like so. Make this bigger. And what we're going to do is Control T on our keyboard, and we're going to drag this so she is on our frame nicely. So as you can see, we've got these bars on the side, which is what we're going to fix now. So we're going to come over here to our rectangle ellipse tool, and we're just going to come out to edit, and we're going to come to content aware scale. So it's very important, guys, hold shift when you're dragging this out, just drag this to the end. It's very important when you're using this setting to make sure that this was converted to a rasterized layer. If it's a smart layer, when you go to when you come up to edit, this will be grayed out because it has to be rasterized. So we're just going to do it to both sides. And there you go, guys. So essentially that is our finished product. So as you can see, we brought back the detail on the side here that would essentially have been, you'd think would be lost. But the last thing I'm going to do is just crop this, just bring her more into the center. Around there looks good to me. And that is it, guys. So essentially that's all for skin retouching and for this photo. I think we did this in about 20-25 minutes, which is actually pretty great. But that is essentially it, guys. I'm super excited to see what you guys are going to create.